Staying in Contact. I'm London Mitchell. Listeners to this program know I'm a history buff. In fact, this year I'm serving as the president of the Toledo History Museum. It's my belief that we become better citizens if we know the history, culture, and heritage of our communities. And that belief is what led me to my guest this week, Toledo author, historian, and storyteller Ted Long. Ted's newest book dives into the year 1856, a turning point in the history of Toledo, when the city was growing fast, was full of ambition, and was focused on the future. The book is titled 1856, A Frontier Town Comes of Age. And while Toledo in 1856 was a city of mud and cholera, it was also a community of spirit.
Yeah, it was. I don't know if it was a surprise. I mean, I always figured that the people who actually put up with everything that you just described to make Toledo what it is, had to have some spirit and had to have a lot of courage. But what came out of it was also this feeling that you describe how things were, and yet I keep saying, and yet they continue to come in droves. Immigrants, people from the East, because they have a feeling that they're going to get in at the ground level, and that they could just see, based on the geographic location, right on the Maumee, right on the Maumee Bay. They could see the railroads coming, the shipping, and I'm sure that they thought, we'll tough this out and it'll be worth it.
All these different groups coming into Toledo, Hungarians, Germans, the Irish, did they get along with one another?
Well, and the fact of the matter is, early on, they don't. Um, we talk about the melting pot, and the great American melting pot, and I love to think of Toledo as a melting pot, and truly it is when you look at what went on over the years. But early on, as these groups arrived, what I find is, and it's very easy to see from just looking at the churches that are sprinkled throughout Toledo, each one of those was really its own little ethnic enclave. You had the Irish down in the warehouse district, and they ended up there because they worked on the canals and then worked on the docks and wharves. Um, the Germans a little bit further south, and they were in the brewery business. But they all kind of stayed in the same neighborhood, and I think some of that's because by sticking together early on, some of the folks who didn't know English, couldn't learn English, could still speak their native tongue. They could go to church, and church was delivered often in the native tongue, or in some cases, both in native tongue and English in a separate service. And so it was a way for them to kind of get grounded and stick together. And then eventually, as generations come through, they start to intermingle, intermarry, and that's when the melting pot happens.
As you describe in the book, Ted, all these people converging on Toledo with a eye on the future. What do they see the city becoming? A big railhead, a big shipping center?
I think in the 1850s, this whole book is built around the year 1856. And I chose that year because I feel like that is the year that Toledo transitioned from, Frogtown, or, just a large village along the river, to something that's going to be a going concern of, an economic powerhouse. And I think at the time in the 1850s, they were really focused on the grain and shipping business, and Toledo was a grain center. And I don't think they knew what was going to come along from an industrial standpoint. But at that time, it was about being located on the lake, having access to all the different ports, and now with the coming of the railroad, um, Toledo becomes essentially a kind of a shipping center. Things are not just coming through Toledo, but things are coming into Toledo and being used to build the city. Um, but it becomes kind of this idea of a cargo hub. Things are offloaded by ship. then loaded on the rail car and shipped to other places. I think they all saw that and thought, there's money to be made.
You mentioned Ted Long, the nickname Frogtown. Even back then, Toledo was getting a ribbing.
Well, it was. I even go into some detail early on in the book about Toledo was known because of the Toledo War, going back to the 1835 Michigan-Toledo border battle. And, Toledo was viewed as kind of a backwoods town. They may have won that war, but it was just kind of viewed as, Toledo. And Frogtown came about just simply because there was so much swamp. I mean, the downtown area we know today was essentially, a muddy mess. And the other nickname that's not so nice was we were also known as the graveyard of the Midwest. As you
Oh,
mentioned early on, we had these incredible cholera epidemics in the late 1840s, early 1850s, and many, many people passed away. And the news got out, and everybody thought it was back then. It was in the air and it was in the mud, and you just don't want to hang out in Toledo. And that's how it got that nickname, Graveyard of the Midwest.
Ted Long, I don't want to give away all that's in the book. I found the book fascinating, a good read, a fast read. But one of the things I thought was interesting is that Toledoans back in 1856 were worried that the city would be overtaken by Sandusky.
Yeah, yeah. Hard to believe. Sandusky was a huge going concern in the 1850s. Um, so was Milan, Ohio, until the railroad showed up. They had built a huge canal from Milan up to Lake Erie shoreline because farmers couldn't get their goods up to the shoreline because of all the mud and bad roads. And so both Sandusky, Milan, those areas were important cargo and shipping centers for the Great Lakes. So yeah, the battle was on. Railroads is what really made Toledo. Railroads bypassed Milan, for example, and their economy literally just fell apart. So yeah, it was a. They were also very concerned about Chicago by the 1850s. They could see how fast the United States was spreading westward. And I think that they knew they had to go very quickly to keep up with what was going on further west, Chicago and St. Louis.
Over and over in the book, Ted, you talk about Toledoans' spirit, how they believed in themselves and that the city could be prosperous. They were full of what I call spirit. And I think that the more a citizenry is engaged in understanding its history, its heritage, its culture, and what the future could hold, the stronger they are, and the stronger the community.
Absolutely agree.
From your research, Ted, how did we come up with the name Toledo?
From what I've read, when they realized that they were going to have to combine Vistula and Port Lawrence in order to win the contract for the canal terminus, they were throwing names around, and someone would throw a name, and someone would say, "Nah, there's already one of those in Pennsylvania," and someone throws another name out. I think there might be one of those in Michigan, and then somebody said Toledo. It's not a name you've heard in the United States. It represents Toledo, Spain. They talked about, and this was all going on coming into the um, what I talked about before, the Toledo War, the Ohio-Michigan border battle. Um, they talked about the strength of that name and the Toledo, Spain being known for its blades, those beautiful handcrafted swords that were, known. If you said it was a Toledo made sword, you knew it was one of great strength. And that's why also the blade ended up with their name, the blade. It's based on the idea that they were going to defend Toledo, uh, like a Toledo Spain blade.
Ted Long, Tell us how we can get a copy of the book, Toledo, 1856, A Frontier Town Comes of Age.
So this book, as you mentioned, it's a pretty short read. Real quickly, I developed this based on a query from a friend of mine. She wanted to know if I knew of whether there was a restaurant in the Island House restaurant, or I'm sorry, hotel that was on Middle Grounds. And so I did some quick research and found that there was. And then I just like stumbled onto this Blade article from, I think it's April of 1856, where it was like 4-column front page, and they describe the building of the Middle Grounds. And by the way, back then they called it the Middle Ground, singular, not plural. And I transcribed that. I found it in the digitized Blade. Could not read it all because it was kind of blurred. So I hopped in the car and drove down to the library, fished it out on microfilm, and then I transcribed it. You can find that on my website, holytoledohistory.com, in the blog section. And it's fascinating. It's pretty lengthy, but it's well worth the read. It just goes into great detail about the work that was going on in 1856 with the coming of the railroad. You got to remember, in 1856, that's when they built the first railroad bridge over the Maumee, and it came across the east side into the Middle Ground. It didn't, you don't think about that, but that's where it landed. And that's why the first train station was there. So anyway, long story short, I took that and then developed this book, Toledo 1856, and then did a ton of research, went down to Kennedy Center, spent a day going through all of the city council minutes for the year 1856, and that was a lot of fun, and put it all together. And it ends up being just really a long essay. So I didn't look for a publisher. I just went ahead and published it online on Kindle. So it's a Kindle ebook. That's how you pick it up. You go to Amazon. You can type my name in. You'll see my other books, but you'll see Toledo 1856, and you download it as a Kindle book.
If you like history, you have to like this book. I found it a fascinating read, Ted, and I can't endorse it enough.
Thank you. And the fun thing, I play around with it quite a bit in the book. The one thing I found really interesting was that was the year they finally got their act together to plumb Toledo for gas lines so they could light the streets at night. And that's when people thought, man, we're really something.
And what is next for Ted Long?
I am working on a really fun project. I've always wanted to do a broader subject, not just Toledo. And so I'm working on a book that I call right now tentatively Ashley's War. And it's the story of James Ashley, congressman from this area, who was the father of the 13th Amendment that freed the slaves. And I'm contrasting him with Morrison Waite, who was Supreme Court Justice, and that Morrison Court was semi-involved in kind of the destruction of Reconstruction. And I'm comparing and contrasting these two men and what it meant to the United States. So it's a Toledo book, but it's also a Civil War book, and it's a broader perspective on American history.
Toledo storyteller Ted Long. I'm London Mitchell, inviting you to join us again next week as we continue staying in contact.
Previous installments of Staying in Contact with London Mitchell are available on the Stream 419 app, Spotify, and londonmitchell.news.